Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Ozymandias Project. Trireme Transit, the newest and most reliable state-of-the-art time-traveling transportation service, is now boarding for all new and returning passengers. Now departing, present ponderings. Next stop is Ancient Odyssey.
Hey everyone, and welcome to episode 7 of the podcast. This week, I got to speak with Dr. Kathleen Coleman, the James Loeb Professor of Classics at Harvard University. She also serves as the chair of the Classics Department and is a senior research curator for the Harvard Art Museums. Her many research interests include Roman mosaics, ancient arena spectacles, Latin literature, and poetry. It was a real treat to be able to welcome the first true Latinist to the podcast, and a pleasure to dig into the other side of the classical field for a change. So take care, stay safe, and I hope you all enjoy this episode, and I will speak to you all next time. All right. Well, I wanted to thank you very much for agreeing to come on the podcast, Dr. Coleman. I was very, very excited because you are actually the first Latinist to make an appearance. I've had several Hellenists and some Egyptologists, but I was really excited to get the other side of classical studies, since it is pretty much the biggest one. So I just wanted to quickly start with how did you get involved with classics? Because it's such an individual journey for everyone. And I really love hearing how different people fall into this really niche subject.
Sure. Well, I was born and grew up in Zimbabwe, which is in Central Africa. And I did Latin at school and loved it. And then went to university to do a law degree, and to the University of Cape Town, actually. And in those days, it was obligatory to study Latin for the law degree. And so I carried on with Latin, and it was the best subject I did in the first year of the BA-LLB. And so I then decided to shelve the law degree. I still haven't done it. And I picked up Greek at that point and carried on with modern languages as well. And then I had to choose, and decided to go with ancient languages. Ended up back in my home city of Harare, where I did an MA. It's actually called an honors degree. And then I was very fortunate. I was encouraged to apply for entry to a doctoral program in England, and I managed to do that. And then I was offered a position back in my old department in Cape Town. So it was just very serendipitous that I followed what really fascinated me. And I never had any idea that it would lead to a lifelong career, where I feel I'm one of the few lucky people in the world who gets paid to pursue their hobby, essentially.
Yes, no, it's such a wonderful thing to be able to find something early on that you love and then be able to pursue it. I sort of discovered a love for the ancient world when I was in 6th grade. That happened to be through a wonderful 6th grade teacher who taught. It was sort of it was labeled as a general history class, but she really stressed the Greek and Roman units and the Egyptology units. So she would come up with really fun things. So for 6th graders, dressing up in fake togas, which were made out of bed sheets, was kind of such a privilege. And so I can see that you are interested in so many different facets within Roman culture. Can you talk a little bit about how you decided to sort of hone down the love of just generally the ancient world and Roman things, and how you focused on mosaic and spectacle and some of the other wonderful things?
Yes, of course. Well, I was primarily trained as a philologist, so a literary person, essentially. But very early on, I got very interested in the material world of the Romans. And for my doctoral dissertation, I wrote a commentary on a book of poems published in the year 95 under the Emperor Domitian. And these were what we call occasional poems, so poems about people's birthdays and the building of a new road and things like that. And there was a lot of social history behind those poems, and indeed quite a lot of material culture. The poem about the making of the road uses all sorts of technical language to describe the curbstones and so forth. And I had a whale of a time going off to Italy to trace the surviving remnants of that road and work out what these different technical terms were talking about. And the interest in mosaics really stems from when I was doing my degree in Harare, because one of my teachers had taken lots and lots of photographs in the ancient, what survives from the ancient world, and did a lot of school visits. And I started tagging along and learning how to package things for school kids. And all these marvelous photographs just seem to enliven everything so much, and the mosaics in particular. So to me, the mosaic record from the ancient world is kind of like a photograph album almost, because so many of the artifacts of daily life are represented on these mosaics, wheelbarrows and garlands and things like that. And they're so durable. That even today we have so many of these floors remaining, and it's really exciting to think about little kids playing marbles on these floors and using the geometric patterns as sort of marble tracks and things like that. To me, the mosaic is one of the most immediate media which puts the ancient world into technicolor, if you like. So anyway, that's one of my interests. But then the arena developed because after I'd published the book from my dissertation, I did a sideways move in the same period to work on the poet Martial, who left us 15 books of epigrams. A lot of them are short and very witty. Well, they're all short because they're epigrams. A lot of them are very witty, and some of them are rather sort of rude, and some of them are very sycophantic, addressed to various emperors. And it was the little collection at the beginning of Martial's oeuvre that particularly caught my attention, because it had all these very elliptical poems about arena spectacles. And so I got involved in trying to figure out what was going on in these poems. And that sparked my interest in the arena much more broadly. And I think I've now written my final article about the arena, but every time I think that I've covered the last related topic, something else comes to mind, and I then write another article. But that's been exciting because it's given me a new mission. When I go to Italy and the Mediterranean, I go on a sort of amphitheater crawl from one amphitheater to the next. They of course they have a basic design, but they're all individually tailored to the topography and to the needs of the community and so on. And you can learn a huge amount by really studying these architectural remains and figuring out what they were used for.
Yes, and when I was an undergrad, I believe in my junior year, I don't actually remember what year, but at some point, the University of Missouri, where I did my undergrad, offered an ancient sport and spectacles class that sort of combined the ancient Olympics and the gladiatorial arena. And I think most students in there would say, oh, well, I watched a film, or I like TV, or I just like the idea of it, or something very common that you would probably hear from a bunch of young students. And I will admit, I definitely went into that class because I love film and TV and a bunch of other things. But I was really surprised that within the class itself, my professor went so much more in depth into not just, the categorizing of, well, this is what they looked like, this is what they wore, or they fought with, and these are some of the instruments used. But he went so much into the architecture and the history of the Colosseum and the building itself. So I was just kind of wondering, is there a certain aspect to ancient spectacles and the arena that interests you more? Is it the architecture, the history, or just the games themselves?
Well, I think it's their function in society. I I believe that the most fundamental fact about the ancient world to grasp is the distinction between slave and free. And you see that playing out so clearly in the arena, because gladiators either were slaves or they were assimilated to the status of slaves by voluntarily taking an oath of submission, actually submitting the control over their lives to their owner-trainer. And this means that they were then property, and you can dispose of your property as you will. And there's a very nice illustration of how this plays out in society from a very small section in a legal text from the 2nd century, where the author Gaius is trying to explain the difference between hire and purchase. And he says, think about gladiators. If you rent a gladiator for your games and he goes back to barracks with a couple of nicks and scrapes, but is basically okay, you pay 20 denarii for him. But if he's so badly injured that he can never fight again, or if he's even killed, then you pay a 50 times markup. You pay 1,000 denarii for him. And he says that's the difference between hire and purchase. And that is so fascinating that he uses that analogy, because it must mean that it was very, very common. Everybody understood the principle of the difference between hire and purchase when they were given the example from the arena. It was absolutely pervasive in the ancient Roman world that the arena was taken for granted. It was part of the fabric of life, and it permeates everything. And that's why we've got so many gladiatorial images. They're on lamps, they were on frescoes, they were on friezes, they were absolutely everywhere. And they were slaves, so they were worthless in social terms, in status terms. And yet, of course, they garnered a following because they exhibited manly courage and all the rest of it. So I think there's a great deal that one can tease out about the Roman mentalité and the Roman psyche from trying to understand the functionings of the arena. And on our course evaluations where I teach, one of the mandatory questions some years ago was something about, how did this course change you? Not a question I invented. I'd never have the chutzpah to ask how my course changed anybody. But 2 of my students who did a course with me called the Roman Games answered, this course taught me that morality is culturally determined. And I thought that was a really interesting answer. I'd never put it to them in those terms. I had simply said to them, to us, the arena is abhorrent. And I want you to leave that emotion outside, come into this and try and understand, without condoning them, try and understand what the Romans thought they were doing. Because I always say to them, people will look back on our culture in 1,000 years' time, and some of the things that we take as fundamental pillars of the way we operate will seem absolutely reprehensible to future generations. And so I wanted them to be able to see that gulf between us and the Romans and try and understand it.
Wow. The course sounds fabulous, and I wish that I could have been a fly on the wall just to be able to hear and see and maybe try to understand how they came to that conclusion, which that's really flattering. So just as you were explaining your interest in the games and the spectacle of it all, it struck me almost because I had a very short flashback to when I was little, which wasn't horribly long time ago, but still long enough that when I was young, we still had Blockbuster DVD, VHS rental stores and similar things. And it almost sounds to me like they treated gladiators like a VHS tape that you could go to the store for entertainment and rent and say, okay, well, I'm going to watch it. It's going to be great. And then when I'm done, it's disposable. You take it back and someone else can go to do with it whatever they'd like. But it's almost likening, to me at least, sort of when they get hurt and then their value kind of goes down and you're like, okay, well, I don't know what to do with this now. it's almost as if when you put an old VHS tape in and then the film cords that are wrapped around inside, when they get all tangled, and then the entire thing becomes useless. And then even Blockbusters would say, oh, please don't return it. Just throw it in the trash. Please just get rid of it. We'll get another better copy. And so just this funny parallel that I was just picking up. It's very striking to me. I would say, does that sound like maybe something sort of comparable, or am I just totally off with that image?
Not exactly. You are right that gladiators are property and they're therefore capital investment. And if your goods are so badly damaged that you can never use them again, then obviously you will dispose of them. But a very interesting find in the 1990s was a graveyard that was excavated by an Austrian team at Ephesus in Turkey. And near the ancient stadium, they found this cemetery that was full of skeletons with very serious wounds that had actually healed over, wounds so deep that they'd affected the skeleton, but you could see that they had healed, and you could tell what they died of when there was an unhealed wound, and that must be what had killed them. So at first they thought that this was a military cemetery, and then they started to find gravestones, and it was clear that actually it was a gladiatorial cemetery. And so from that skeletal material, we can see that the Dr. Galen, who was the doctor in charge of the gladiatorial barracks at Pergamum, was not telling a fib when he described how extensive his treatment had been of gladiators. We can see that it was only as a last resort that you would have abandoned a gladiator. They were too expensive, their training had taken too long, and was too much invested in them to let a mere wound that hit the shin or the rib or the skull or whatever, to let that kill the guy. So that, and it also apparently is the case that if you clean a wound, even a very severe wound, chances are the person might recover. And certainly the forensic studies of these skeletal remains from Ephesus has vindicated that belief. So you are kind of right, but that VHS tape would have to be really wrecked for somebody to put it in the trash if it was
okay. Okay, so then maybe it's closer to horse racing, perhaps, where if it gets hurt, you obviously want to try to rehab it because you're putting thousands of dollars and hours into training if it breaks a leg. So you try very hard, and then if it just can't overcome that injury, then as a last resort, you put it down. So,
yes.
Okay. So I just want to turn back a little into if there were young people who said, oh, this all sounds so amazing, so interesting, I have the same interests as both of us, and said, I'm a high school student and I'm looking to go to university and study this, but I don't know where to go. I don't know where to find these things. A problem I've often noticed is the general accessibility, because most programs I've just sort of noticed over my years aren't the best advertised. So for young students who may have an enormous interest in studying the ancient world, but just don't know it's there to study, it was more of, how do we do a better job of saying, hey, we exist, we're here, please, we want you, we desperately would love for you to come and take our classes and be majors, when so many would otherwise, maybe if they get lucky through a friend, discover, oh, there's a mythology course, oh, I'm going to take that course, and then through that sort of discovery process find that there's a classics department.
It is the case that those of us who teach the ancient world have to be entrepreneurial and advertise what we're doing. And I think the departments that are called departments of classics are at a bit of a disadvantage because it's such a vague term, and people don't know that means Greek and Roman antiquity. And some departments, of course, are more explicit in their naming. practices. But we all face the same problem, which is how to reach the students who, whether they know it or not, are looking for us. And one way to do that, of course, is to teach in general education programs and to be very present at all the kinds of fairs where the majors are advertised and that kind of thing. I think also visits to high schools is a very good idea, where you're making sure that the students realize that this is something that can be studied at college, and that there are very many different places where it may be hiding in college curricula. So either in formal departments or in programs attached maybe to foreign language departments or even in the history department. So it is something that one has to excavate a little bit and try and find. And then comparative studies are also a good way to get people interested. I'm particularly keen on the idea that the ancient Greco-Roman world and the ancient world in the Far East are comparable in so many ways. And there are now books being written about, the Roman Empire, Han Dynasty, and all that kind of thing. And so I think we're likely to see more sort of world history or global history in antiquity being generated probably in history departments, and that's a way of helping students to see connections across the planet in these periods. So yes, I think I would encourage any young person who's enjoyed a sword and sandals movie on TV or something to find out from their school counselor, is there a college nearby that teaches this kind of stuff? Because I'd be interested in doing it. And the other thing we have to do is market all the data that shows that humanities majors earn well across their career. People think that a humanities major is not going to be a ticket to any sort of job, which is absolutely not true, because what you learn is how to think and reason and be articulate and be able to put building blocks of different pieces of evidence together and be able to both write and speak in a coherent manner. That the humanities teaches that, as you know, and we should be being much more forthright about those skills, the problem-solving skills that you learn from the humanities, as well as developing empathy and all the kind of human emotional skills that will repair some of the rifts in society.
Of course, of course. And in terms of marketing to young students who are in high school, or perhaps even young freshmen in their first year at university who are very impressionable and still have no idea and may not declare a major until junior year. There are so many different ways and ideas out there. And one of them that I'm particularly interested in, and I would just appreciate what you would think about this particular strategy, is in the past, I've had conversations just with friends of mine, former professors, and I said, I think anyone around my age is going to be particularly interested in the film aspect. Oh, I watched the Elizabeth Taylor Cleopatra and I fell in love with ancient Egypt, or I saw the Brad Pitt Troy and I love ancient Greece. But there's always the problem of accuracy in portrayal in film and TV. And so I don't know, is that maybe the best medium? Because I believe two things tend to happen. One, we see this glamorized version and then we think, oh, okay, well, maybe all of it's going to be this glamorized version. And as we know, when you actually take the time to study and read anything from those time periods, it's often just not the case. And so one, people might find, oh, well, if the reality is not quite as glamorous, maybe that's not what I'm looking for. And two, just from having two friends of mine who really loved the ancient world, but instead of going into classics, they took this opportunity and seeing things through media as, oh, I want to become an actress. I want to go into the theater program because this looks so amazing. Instead of studying it, I actually want to just go dress up and pretend I am somebody back then. So is media really actually handy, or is it something we tell ourselves, oh, this might work?
No, I think we ought to exploit every connection that leads people to an interest in antiquity. And I think that the lesson is that however exciting and interesting it looks in Hollywood, it's even more interesting when you study it, in its original context. And the Romans and the Greeks give us a wonderful opportunity to see both similarity and difference, that there's so much that's the same, and then there's so much that's radically different from today. And getting people to kind of drill down and start to explore these similarities and differences, I think it's just a safe space, because it's so long ago and so far away, the ancient Greek and Roman world, for us here in North America in the 21st century. It's a social experiment, if you like. One of my favorite expressions is to talk about classical antiquity as a laboratory of the human condition, because I think that's what it is.
It can be whatever the individual wants it to be. One thing that I always say to anyone who asks me about my background or my passion for the ancient world, and I say, well, it's an odyssey, for one. When you get into it, how you get into it, that's always going to be different. Why you're attracted to it and what keeps you coming back and wanting to learn more. Obviously, it's very individualized. So it's an odyssey, and I think you can definitely make it into whatever you want it to be. If you are interested in learning more about the ancient world, I'm very encouraging of one of my friends who wants to be an actor, took a serious interest in taking a lot of classics courses. And I asked her once, I said, why shouldn't you be going and taking things in the theater department if that's clearly what you want to do? And she said, well, I love the research aspect. I've always loved period pieces. And if I'm going to properly, to the best of her ability, try to represent these time periods and these people, she said she really wanted a really great idea of the context for which she'd be portraying characters. So I said, oh, it's so admirable. I mean, I think she ended up getting a double major in theater and classics because she wanted the background and the historical context, and then was able to take that, use that, have those research and thinking skills, and then apply it to whatever roles she may encounter in the future. So there's so many different ways you can get into and use the classical background, if you will. And even for the younger students, children out there who aren't anywhere near being able to go to university yet. I notice in our modern culture, we have so many things. I don't know if you've seen it, but Lego just released the newest, biggest buildable Lego set, and it's of the Roman Colosseum. It's like 9,000 pieces or something humongous. And when I first saw it, I said, I want it. I want to have this giant Lego building in my house. So I just see we take these cool aspects from the ancient world, and then we put them in Legos. We put them in, I think Playmobil has a set of Roman buildings and architecture and gods. And you can honestly apply classics, anything to almost any field we have here. I was just trying to think the other day about what modern professions, other than going into the field, may benefit from a classical background. And it's quite a Herculean task to think about that. From your perspective, if a student were to come to you as the chair of the department, and say, I don't really know where I can go, but I definitely want to get the degree in classics, but I need help. What would you advise a young student who doesn't maybe want to go on to graduate work?
Well, I think going, straight into a profession is one possibility. For the financial world or something like that, you can do straight from a classics degree. Classics degrees still have a certain sort of fascination value, and interview committees often really want to talk about people's classics degrees and why they took them and what they learned. And it's also possible, of course, with a good classics degree to get into a good law school, or if you've been pre-med, a good medical school, or go off and do the MAT, become a teacher. There are all kinds of things. Our majors at the school where I teach go off and do all kinds of things. And we, one of the things we do is put our aspiring students in touch with former alums who can talk to them about, 5 years ago, I left the classics program with my degree, and this is what I've done with it. This is what it meant to me. And I think that's often much more persuasive than us telling them that it's all going to be fine. You want to talk to people who've done that and gone out into the world and how they used their degree and what their degree meant to them. And I think we should be harvesting our alumni as much as possible. They're usually very, very anxious to talk to future students because they had a wonderful experience. So they want to make sure other people will as well.
Yes, of course. And just sort of thinking along those same lines in terms of engagement and almost just spreading the influence, whether through talking to professors or alumni, or just on a grander sense beyond talking to one student or whatnot. So much of what I perceive to be influences from the ancient world influence our collective culture, our collective ideas on everything from morality to aesthetics. And one thing I was just sort of reading about the other day was the influence of architecture and I wish I had a better word for this, but clothing styles, I suppose. I don't know if there's a more professional term for that. But just the influence of those things on our modern culture, where we see it reflected in all the government buildings. A lot of universities have architecture that are modeled after Greco-Roman buildings. But for me, one thing that really caught my attention was this sort of fascination with the clothing aspect. I was watching a film just the other day, and I thought to myself, everyone here seems to be wearing uniforms. Now, uniforms, they have so many different roles and interpretations in the modern world, so that's very broad. But when I think back to my classical education and my experience, I think back to, well, in ancient Greece, everything's very individualized. Nothing's the same. There's a lot more freedom of almost sort of individuality there. But then I think about the Romans and the empire. Everything was sort of uniformly sort of uniformity was brought in, essentially. And so I kind of wanted to just ask you a little bit about when thinking about ancient spectacles. I often think of ancient Roman military parades and other events where the military figures are paraded through and venerated essentially for their strength and their skill and their wisdom. And is that something that we've been influenced by, that has almost been passed down, this sort of love of spectacle of military parades, almost like the ones that we have here now in the modern culture? I know several countries, for celebrating certain holidays like to have military parades. And I was just thinking about it as such an interesting phenomenon in its own right. Just why do we do these? Why do we have them? Is this something that we got from the Roman Empire? I wasn't really sure.
I doubt that we got it directly from the Roman Empire. I think many cultures have had this kind of tendency. And I think it relates to the power balance in society. With societies with a very strong military want to parade it and make sure that the population supports it and buys into this massive sort of budgetary expenditure on the militarization of the society. And the Roman triumph is something a little bit different, I think, because it is the triumphant general who is primarily being paraded. And it's a very curious mixture between veneration of him and also an awareness that his status should not be overdone, that the foreigner is simultaneously, if you like, sort of exhibited as a trophy in the general's achievement, and it's a religious ritual. There's a very special route, and it's only performed when a formal triumph is celebrated. So when there's been sufficient victory to justify this, and the booty that the triumphant general brings back with him is then pledged for projects for the public good. So that's often temples being built to thank the gods, for looking after us and making sure that we won. And the Colosseum itself, we now know from the restoration of a damaged inscription, we now know that the Colosseum itself was one of those buildings, that it was vowed as the booty to be built out of the booty of a foreign conquest. And the only foreign conquest that's available at that period is, in fact, the victory in Judea under Vespasian and Titus, when you stand on the Sacra Via and look through the Arch of Titus, which has in the vault, it's got on the sides, it's got the reliefs of the booty coming back to Rome from Jerusalem, and the menorah is depicted there. You look through that archway and you see the Colosseum at the bottom of the slope, and the Colosseum is the realization of the booty that is depicted on the walls of that archway. So there's it's not to call it a military parade, I think, would be to miss the point or go past the point of the triumphal procession in Roman society, and the religious aspect and the sort of the foreign relations aspect of it is extremely important.
Of course, yes. I often, when rough ideas get sort of passed down, a lot of the original meaning is just sort of forgotten or lopped off or hidden, which is often very sad, because I do love learning about the original meanings behind things. No one in the ancient world just did things to do them, for the most part. Another thing I sort of was thinking about was when I read the Aeneid during my senior year in college, the obvious portrayal of Queen Dido as the very extravagant, wealthy, basically pinned with all the attributes that the Romans would later just sort of say, no, we don't want to be associated with monarchy, with queenship, with kingship. It's all, we don't want that. our societies today, we do like to say they are very based off the Roman ideals of the Roman Republic. And we also don't really look kindly upon anything other than just a sort of constitutional monarchy the way they do in the UK. So can we sort of trace our original dislike of monarchy and what they sort of stand for almost to the ancients and through them to their mythologies?
I'm not sure whether that connection is direct. I think the United States Constitution has a great deal to do, obviously, with colonization by the British and the struggle for independence in the 18th century. And an analogy, of course, is the Republican ideals of the ancient Romans. But that republic was not a success. I mean, it collapsed. You got these strong men rising and overturning the rules and marching on Rome and all the rest of it. And then what came out of that was essentially an autocracy. It was the establishment of the Principate by Augustus, and became a dynastic principle, which then, of course, petered out with Nero. And then you get that year of terrible sort of political instability, in which there were 4 emperors in one calendar year, the year 69, and ultimately the last of them, Vespasian, triumphed and established a new dynasty. So I think, if anything, studying the Roman Republic makes one realize not the strength of democratic principles, but their fragility. And that's something that we really have to remember today. And the shell of the republic was maintained, the semblance of republican rule, but effectively, as I say, it was replaced by autocracy after the Battle of Actium.
Well, I wrote an essay during my time in university, and I think the question of the essay was, did Augustus save or destroy the old Roman Republic? And of course, I chose to write, no, he destroyed the entire thing. He just said goodbye to this, and I'm going to set up my own way of doing things. And I don't remember a lot about what I wrote, but it was a fun one to write and to think about. And that was the year I finally read the Res Gestae, and yeah, it was just such an interesting experience. But I would say, just through our discussion, I've just noticed that a lot of the overall arching themes that sometimes we can make the connection, sometimes we can't, whether it's roughly based off of, or maybe there's a small idea that was taken and changed between the ancients and our modern society, though, is it seems like no matter what you study or where you go, you are going to find some aspect of the ancient world tucked in there that can offer us insight or clues to how we go about navigating life today. And a lot of I've just noticed that the common trend right now is sort of the defunding of the humanities in general, because we just say, oh, well, they're not really that important, or they're fun, but how will they help us solve world issues? And whether or not reading things like the Aeneid or the Res Gestae will actually help us, sort of to your earlier point, where studying the classics is really a study of the human condition, and as that one student said, sort of a look at morality. If those are the kinds of things that we're saying, I would figure that it would make studying and funding the humanities even more important than ever, to make sure we don't fall into bad habits, so we don't become the next failed Roman Republic. With all the troubles that classics departments are sort of confronted with today, at least, and I don't know if it will be a continuing trend in the future. I certainly hope not. Is there anything we can do currently as professors, grad students, ambassadors, if you will, who've studied the ancient world? What can we do going forward to sort of speak up on behalf of all of our departments and say, we are relevant and we can prove it? I mean, it's so hard to place monetary value on something as subjective as the humanities. But, you know, is there anything we can do sort of to make a case for ourselves and say, we're important, please help?
I think we need to make sure that the very successful members of society who've had a humanities training or specifically a classics training talk in public and write in the media about their experience. I think ours is a society which looks to prominent people for guidance and for models, and very successful CEOs and, you know, people in Hollywood and so on. They are the people who should be speaking up for a humanities training, because they're the living proof that you can really make it to the top of society with that kind of background.
It's so difficult or I've found that it's so difficult sometimes to ask successful people to get involved in something as thorny as funding these programs, just because of all the different implications that could probably happen and political ramifications notwithstanding. But there's such an obvious disconnect between, yes, I think people realize that it's important, sort of on that very baseline level of, oh, well, we got to start, or we learned, or we understand how these things are connected. But to encourage people, I suppose, to, I don't know, it's such a thorny issue, or it can be. Just the trend, following the trend lines of society. Sometimes we have a lot of people encouraging the STEM fields or something quote unquote useful, sort of the trade school model, which I will admit they're very important, and we do need people to go into those areas. But there's got to be a better way to tie in the usefulness of the classics with, well, you're going into trade school, you're going to be an architect, you're going to be a agriculturalist, something, I don't know, something useful. But to even try to convince people to study something where they don't really see an immediate payoff monetarily, or they don't see the immediate value in, well, why should I learn this? Because those people were really, really old and they don't really, their problems are all different from mine and we have better technology. So I don't think that, you know, this is right for me kind of attitudes. So to a young urban designer who says, well, we've got all the new technology. Why? Is there a way to convince someone like that to say, well, no, I think you can take an ancient architecture course or something that may not overtly seem connected to their desired career path?
Yeah, I do think that one has to emphasize the breadth of training is very important. And knowing the background to where we are today is also very, very important. And I do think that people who have become very successful in society and have taken that route are important models who should be held up so that people can see, well, actually, this is true. It's not just a professor trying to pull the wool over my eyes, but it's actually the case that here is somebody who's convinced me in very articulate terms that what they learnt in college, which is apparently pointless, has been fundamental in training their attitudes, their way of thought, their problem-solving ability, their articulate skills, and so on. So I think we have to really corral the people who have that model status, and without them pledging a single cent in dollar terms, they can simply be spokespersons, because society listens to people who are successful in society's terms, successful in society's terms.
And do you think there is a space maybe for these more successful people to, if they don't choose to do it themselves and speak up, is there a space for them to sort of lift up other young people who do have these backgrounds? So yes, advertising is important, and if you have people in the film industry or any of these big architectural CEOs, big names, is there space for them to sort of say, well, I have a little bit of training, I'm not an expert, but I know this person here, and I'd like to sort of give them a platform to explain what they do, since they can better talk about it? And would people find that engaging? Would people say, okay, well, this person I very much admire, this famous person isn't going to talk about it, but if they suggest I listen to this thing or read this, whatever, do you believe that may be a way to get people interested? Just sort of stepping back and giving someone, an actual expert, airtime.
Yeah, sure. If then the name of that well-known person is behind them, absolutely. TED Talks, things like that. And also, if people are very successful in monetary terms and have, made a lot of money, they could fund a scholarship for somebody who is from a disadvantaged background to study one of these ostensibly pointless subjects, which would then raise them up and give them the tools to be successful in society. So people who are not willing to put their name out there might be willing to put their pocketbook out there. You never know.
Yeah, of course. There are so many different ways that it's fun to just sort of theorize. How do we get the word out? How may this work out? How can this happen? And of course, the answer is we don't really know. We just have to find people, hopefully, who'd be willing to help us out. And so just to wrap everything up, at the end of each podcast, as I mentioned before, I like to have each guest read the poem Ozymandias by Percy Shelley, just because I find that it's such a gorgeous poem, and it's still so relevant, and it has so many different messages, and I like to understand how people think.
Sure. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, "Two vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk, a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things, the hand that mocked them and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear, my name is Ozymandias, King of Kings. Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains, round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away."
I think it's such a gorgeous, gorgeous poem. And as an expert on poetry, obviously this isn't ancient Roman poetry, but just as an expert with poetry in general, what is this poem trying to say to us? Is there anything about what the meter it's written, the length, or just the incredible visual description in it? Is that the key to understanding the poem, or is it more in just the sort of metaphorical value of it underneath?
It's a sonnet. and the structure of the sonnet, the 14 lines, is one of the most perfect articulations, I think, of human thought in the English language. And it's so condensed, and the rhyming schemes are so seductive, if you like, that you're led to the conclusion, which is the vanity of human ambition. And all of that grandeur and boastfulness has now been reduced to shattered stone in the middle of a desert. So what was the point of it all? That's really, I think, a very powerful message from this poem.
And in your opinion, what makes this one of the most famous poems? Why this poem rather than the secondary version? Because most people, when they think of Ozymandias, they will think of the Shelley version, and not many people I know of the sort of second lesser version, as I like to call it.
Well, it was all bred of those discoveries in Egypt in the 19th century. Am I in the right century? The 19th century, and it was also a competition. And I think the excitement, it's the beginning of archaeology, discovering these things, digging them up. It's what you find of ancient society, this poem is saying, is just a few shattered scraps. It must have been a wonderful sense that we are now able to discover these things and look what became of them. It tells you something about the fragility of human society, I think. And this poem, I mean, it's Shelley, so every word is in the right place and every rhythm is correct. And it's really, I think, a wonderful encapsulation of that sense of human fragility and the vanity of human ambition.
And obviously the poem is very deep, so anyone who's had training in the classics, anyone who perhaps just loves literature during their time in university is going to just find the meanings and the depth to it and love reading it. Would this be a good poem for perhaps younger people? Would I be able to take this poem to my 6th grade class and get as much out of it, or is it a bit too sophisticated for perhaps a 7th grader?
I don't think it's too sophisticated. I think most children of that age would relate to the sort of the emotive quality of the rhyme scheme and the rhythms. And I think the message is very straightforward in this poem. And I think that children of that age are sufficiently mature to be able to appreciate the sort of the passage of the years and how kind of, I suppose, how very ephemeral the survival of culture is. And that's something else that comes through in this poem.
Well, that's a beautiful note to end it on. So I just wanted to thank you again so much for taking the time to join me on the podcast. It has been a pleasure learning more about the spectacle of the ancient world and from the Roman side. And just sort of, I wanted to also thank you for bearing with me as my jumbled complex of a brain sort of tries to figure its way out, navigating the different influences from the ancient world onto the modern world. So thank you so much.
You're most welcome, Lexie. I enjoyed talking to you. Thank you for your project.
Trireme Transit is now departing ancient Odyssey. Next stop is Present Ponderings. I met a traveler from an antique land who said, 2 vast and trunkless legs of stone stand in the desert. Near them on the sand, half sunk a shattered visage lies, whose frown and wrinkled lip and sneer of cold command tell that its sculptor well those passions read, which yet survive, stamped on these lifeless things. The hand that mocked them, and the heart that fed. And on the pedestal these words appear. My name is Ozymandias, King of Kings, Look on my works, ye mighty, and despair. Nothing beside remains. Round the decay of that colossal wreck, boundless and bare, the lone and level sands stretch far away.